Great. Well, let's dive on in. I mean, just the two of you have had such a tremendous career in sports and marketing in the world of brands and real experts. So your bios speak for yourself. I would love you to just share a few highlights because I'm sure a lot of people know you. I've been flooded by, just your reputation in the business, just being part of this. But why don't you just share something that, has been your passion point in what you do, and then we can dive into all the NIL stuff. So Rob, would you like to kick it off?
Geez, put me on the spot first. Sure, why not? So hey, I'm Rob Hersey. I'm Group Creative Director at Mediabrands Content Studio, which is a newly formed agency within Interpublic Group. And so we specialize in really creating audience-led creative ideas that really manifest themselves in content and provide unique ways to reach audiences. A lot of the times this can be through content partnerships. This could be through branded content. This could be through things that are done with talent and athletes. So, it's all about trying to figure out how brands can reach their audiences in the most impactful way. And how do we move, across media, across different platforms where people are, and how do we move culture? So, some of the brands that I've worked on in my tenure here across Mediabrands and Universal McCann and some of the other agencies within IPG are Coca-Cola, American Express, Spotify, Rocket Mortgage. A lot of large brands that are always trying to, that have a lot of large scale sports sponsorship deals, but are also always looking for new ways to actually, drive relevant connections with people that love sports and athletes.
Great. Emeka?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. It's good to see you. Michelle too. So my name is Emeka Ofodile, VP of Sports Marketing here at ESPN. So what that means is that, I oversee the consumer and brand marketing for live sports at the company. So whether it's, the NFL or NBA, UFC, soccer, my group is responsible for, driving people to, view the events on ESPN or subscribe through ESPN Plus, as well as developing a real brand relationship with ESPN through the live sports platform. So that's what I do, and it's exciting to be here.
So let's dive on in. I know this is a passion point, the NIL space for all of us. I've been studying this for my thesis. I have 50 pages to write, I think, in the next 80 days. So that's going to be a body of work. But, every day something is changing. I mean, it's been a pivotal 2 weeks just from, the NLRB now, the question about student, as employers in this space. And then just on Friday, Division I is restructuring their rules and seeing what's going to happen with the NCAA. So this is literally just 2 weeks, let alone the big cases that are going to be determined in the year ahead. So I'd love to talk, because we had a little powwow and, we discussed the opportunity that NIL has provided, making the college landscape more equitable. It's a tremendous opportunity for the athletes to get compensated, but to really build a sustainable brand. How have you both been involved in this process with your respective companies, as well as you personally? So what are your thoughts on this?
I think what's super interesting with NIL and just sort of listening to the last panel is that, it's all new, right? So in a lot of ways, the frameworks that exist now might not be the frameworks that exist tomorrow and the next day. But what it does provide, right, and what you do see, I do think, is some macro trends that is potentially changing the college space for the better. So I think one of them is this idea of whether you call it inclusion or you call it, having, sports and athletes before who might have been underrepresented because they weren't necessarily part of the big 2 or 3 or, now have a chance to really sort of grow their brand, bring interest to their sport through the NIL, mechanism. And I think that is really connected to the idea, and I really believe, the growth of sort of the female college athlete and female college sports in terms of, now there's, essentially a marketing platform that comes through the individual and probably the brands that the individual is bringing to all of a sudden start to talk about women's college basketball, gymnastics in a way that the traditional media, framework doesn't necessarily always provide the opportunity. So I think that's like super interesting. I also think the other trend, the other observation is like we have to think about the individual athlete and this idea of maximizing and matching your sort of height of athletic impact and earning power, right? So for a lot of athletes who are not going, the next level, right, or not playing in the NBA or not playing, on Sundays, NIL now provides you the opportunity to perhaps sort of maximize the peak of your athletic, sort of ceiling, with the financial, connection to that, and I think that is like really interesting across the board. So you're starting to see, sort of the changes that, these sort of macro opportunities that it could provide, but it's also changing every day, and I think what might be something that we think about today might be different tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo some of the great points that Emeka made, is that, I think it's no surprise that sports marketing has been successful historically in the past. Sports are an amazing vehicle for telling really captivative and inspiring stories and really looking at, the full human potential kind of coming to life. But, when you look at kind of the big sports that get kind of the traditional spotlight, so to speak, a lot of them, like Emeka had mentioned, that they really are at that pinnacle point in the athlete's career where they've kind of finally made it and gone pro. And that there's a lot of really amazing young athletes that are kind of just breaking the paradigm and really doing amazing things both on and off the court, or field, or what track, whatever, or swimming pool, whatever this college sport may be. And it really provides brands, more freedom, I think, to create more authentic partnerships between these athletes, instead of just aligning with kind of a marquee sport that everyone kind of knows and supports. And I also think it just provides a unique opportunity to reach the right audience as well. A lot of the brands that I work on currently and have worked on historically in the past often have a high emphasis in targeting a young audience, mainly Gen Z, along with, I'm sure every brand loves to just trying to attract Gen Z consumers. But sometimes you can fall into an interesting kind of contradiction there when we talk about college level sports, because while there are a lot of young people playing in the sport, some of the people that are watching and consuming sports content aren't necessarily that consumer. And some ways that they are consuming that sports content is very different. They most are often are apt to consume highlight content. They're more interested in some of the reels and the moments within these sports rather than watching a full 90 minute 120 minute game. So, this provides a unique opportunity for brands to kind of reach a younger consumer and create more organic and authentic relationships with those consumers, but also still, reaching, the wider demo that's still, supporting college sports and tuning into college sports every day.
And what would you say is the right way to get involved in this space from an athlete standpoint, as you're looking at picking the right athletes, and from a brand standpoint?
From an athlete standpoint, it always comes down to, like, I think for every athlete, whether you're at the pro level, the college level, it always comes down to, like, what is authentic to you, right? What is something that I think, represents who you are in full, and if it's something that you're passionate about and represents sort of like where you want to go. Because, like, I think for athletes, the key is, like, if you're going to pursue an interest, right? If you're going to go down a road, like, you want to make sure that is authentic to you. You're going to do your homework on it, put in the time, because once, you're out there, your audience wants to know that truly represents you, and your brand wants to know, the brand that the partners with you wants to know that's truly you, and that's something that they can grow with. Right. So I think from an athlete perspective, I actually think it's a little bit of like introspection to start, right? Like, of like, what is going to be something that, you're like, hey, this is what I'm about, and this is what I'm going to, really sort of put kind of my full person and wade into and really grow as I grow with this. And that in itself will attract interest, will attract brands. So I think from an athlete perspective, is that like, you know, kind of like, what is that sort of fundamental value that you're willing to say, this is the stake in the ground of who I am and of what I want to represent?
I think you bring up a really great point, because it also speaks to kind of giving empowerment to the athletes. And I think historically, maybe in the past, they haven't had that opportunity. I mean, you see many athletes when they're starting out in their careers, it's kind of interesting to watch how brand deals kind of unfold and how they kind of build their credentials in their careers, where, you know, they might be doing, you know, some local advertising for, you know, a insert, you know, whatever fast food chain, you know, one day, and then ultimately, you know, signs a major deal for a major brand where they're, you know, their long-term advocate and spokesperson. So, you know, being having you know, these athletes have the opportunity to actually kind of work on building their credentials, their resume, and their brand relationships from an early stage really does allow them to kind of grow and maximize and mature over time. And I think what you said is, you know, kind of what I agree with too, as you know, I think we will probably say it 1,000 times throughout this conversation, but it really is just based on an authentic partnership. And I think that's the most important thing. So, you know, even just giving an example of when Boost Mobile, you know, was one of the first, or if not the first brand to kind of give an endorsement deal to college athletes in the Cavinder twins. It felt so right for Boost Mobile because they're always a brand that represents supporting marginalized voices, and, you know, college female basketball players. I mean, I think can certainly qualify as ones that, you know, haven't necessarily gotten the proper spotlight, and, you know, and that they have so much more, especially, you know, these, you know, the two individuals have so much more to offer outside of just their game on the court. So, I mean, it really comes down to, you know, what is the value proposition that you're adding to these athletes, and how are you building this long-term partnership for the long haul? Because I think that's another radical shift too. I think that for brands to do this, especially, you know, for these individuals that are, you know, they're not just young athletes, they're young people. Really building that relationship for the long term instead of a short term kind of sponsorship plays is very important.
I know Jim spoke about this earlier on, but I think 8 months ago when it first started, there was a bigger gap between male, female. And now he said it's a more even split. But what I've just noticed from looking at these different, you know, the way athletes are selected, some of the larger deals versus some of the, you know, other deals. I mean, it's interesting because football and basketball are always driving, but it seems when you look at the male, female, like females, they might have some of the bigger deals, but they might not be per se at a Division I school, you know, doing gymnastics or soccer or whatnot. I'd love to hear sort of your take, because this is a big time for women in sports, you know, this week especially. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. And, you know, I know some of the women are really leading the charge here, but, you know, what are your thoughts on this? And how do you approach and give, you know, fair equity for not just the 1 percentile who get those huge deals, but also the rest of, you know, the team? So just those two things.
Yeah, like I think it's a good question, right? Because ultimately, like what we're asking for is like, hey, what's the best way to sort of, you know, for an athlete to get out there? Do I need to be at, you know, sort of the biggest spotlight all the time? And do I need to be winning championships and everything else for, you know, brands to be interested? I don't think that's the story here. I think what NIL is essentially, it's a conversation at the intersection of like performance and story, right? So every college athlete playing at a high level, like that is, you know, let's define that is like pinnacle performance. So like an athlete who is there has achieved that performance metric. Yes, you might, you know, an athlete might be sort of different if, you know, they're playing in the national championship game, but that doesn't necessarily compromise an athlete who is playing in a different type of game at a different level, because they've achieved that college level performance to say, hey, I'm truly an athlete, you know, and I work every day, every week, off season, and I'm putting in the time. So I feel like what's really interesting is like there's this, you know, kind of like entryway of performance that everyone has achieved. And now is like, how do you build upon that? And now it becomes the story, the brand, who you are, how you engage your audience, what are your fundamental values and how you articulate that. And that's what, ultimately is going to separate, I think, athletes in terms of how they, take advantage of the space. And I also think that's also what's really interesting about, female athletes and, and what they're doing in terms of bringing attention to female college sports, because it's a story about, performance, but it's also a story about brand and story and how you story tell that and who you are. And I think that's what's really cool about NIL. It's like this idea of like performance and storyteller is going to be the key that I think separates people.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I just think it opens up the flexibility and kind of the efficiency of a brand when they really want to, connect with a particular audience. And instead of going for, the biggest D1 schools, they can really focus in on, those stories and those athletes that are truly reflective of who they are and their principles and their values. So brands that do that may be playing a more focused approach, but they also have the ability to win and speak to a broader audience in the long term, which is really important. And I think a lot of brands that are focused are rewarded, in the future. I mean, this isn't related to NIL, but I thought one example in the space that I thought was always a great one was how Adidas a couple years ago started airing high school football games on Friday nights. It was called like Friday Night Stripes. And I thought that was really, really smart because, it's a big brand and you're using your spotlight to put, to create a platform for, a group of athletes that, historically really hadn't had that opportunity and may feel like it's a local tactic. But again, the athletic stories can kind of transcend and these individuals can resonate with a lot more people, even if they're not, playing in a predominant sport or, a D1 college necessarily. It's really about, what are the values that, these athletes embody, and how is the brand, really playing an active role in helping these values come to life.
Yeah, 100%, Rob. And I think, another point here is about is this rise of the micro medium influencer, right? Because I think what NIL will provide is that it doesn't always have to be, you're certainly going to have the folks who have the big followings, right? And sort of everyone knows about that athlete on a national scale. But I actually think what we're also going to be looking at for brands, especially, is engaging with athletes who have, an audience that's fully engaged and fully sort of bought into that athlete. Because for a brand, that's what you want, right? You want sort of that connection and that high engagement and that loyalty. And I think, the folks who are the micro and the medium, sort of followings have that, right? And are telling that story and building that audience. And I think that's going to be ultimately attractive to brands.
I mean, again, just to echo what you said, I mean, this is something that we see beyond sport, that there's definitely a more emphasis in micro, nano influencers, however you want to coin them, but people that just have more of a dedicated and authentic fan base. And it's really true when they have a true brand partnership versus a brand sponsor. So it's very important.
What are your thoughts on, a lot of these big educational institutions, me being at UCLA, they have Jordan and a bunch of brands already. There were some discussions about taking those existing partnerships and seeing, is there a smart way to do some kind of carve out for the athletes specific of that team? Let's say there's a big partner that really wants to get behind empowering the athlete and for the long haul, like a real brand. Everyone has kind of tailor picked, but really getting invested behind. What would you like to see? What are your thoughts on really making a scalable imprint if somebody wants to really be invested to make a mark in a large way in this space?
And Michelle, you mean from a school perspective or for a brand sort of looking to go,
both,
national?
from from a school perspective in terms of a brand who's already partnered with that school, and then just in general, what would be a scalable way to really look at this? What do the athletes need? What does the industry need right now to really make a mark, like we're seeing just this week, a bunch of scholarships. A few athletes have raised their hands to really help one another out, and started their own scholarship, sort of where you can put your essays through, but you're seeing a lot of these different types of models. What are your thoughts? What's the right way? Do you kind of like do that kind of carve out for existing sponsors, or do you create a new kind of like venture model? Like, I don't know what's missing from the pipeline. Obviously educational is so important. I wish LegalZoom and, you mentioned Rocket Mortgage and TurboTax, like they should come in and just be the ones helping these athletes in a large way build their businesses. But I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, look, I think in a lot of ways the model is like currently being built, right? So, I think the models will ultimately change. But what I think one thing we do know is that a lot more schools are now developing their own NIL program, right? And I think that's kind of what you're going to see, is that schools ultimately, I think, are going to sort of get involved in a much more proactive way, to have a framework, where they work with their athletes, but also represents something from a school level. And I think that is going to be interesting, and how that looks from a school level, from a conference level, and you go from there. So I think that's probably the one part I've been sort of paying attention to, is just like how the schools are starting to engage, and how they're starting to engage, in terms of to your point, at scale, right? Where it's not just a couple of schools, but it's like, hey, it's these schools over here, these schools over here, and, seeing where that goes.
Well, even like Michigan, influencer works with Michigan, and they created the exchange program, and they're actually putting together, having sort of that forum where they can come and communicate and sort of get matched up. Other schools, it's different what Texas is doing versus UCLA. Everyone has their own sort of model. I know UCLA is working with our law school with, students helping look over contracts for athletes, which is a nice cyclical sort of utilizing the resources from an educational standpoint, as well as at the business school. So everyone has their own, version of this, which is really interesting to see take form.
Absolutely. And I think, on as it relates to the topic, I think one brand that I saw that did this kind of effectively was StockX. And what they did was by creating the Air Jordan shoe for the University of Oregon. But, instead of just leveraging the equity and cool factor, of this sneaker and just selling out as StockX is really built on, they really use it as an opportunity to raise money and give back to the school and the community. So I think that's really important, because community is the kind of the overlooked element with all this, because, with pro level athletes, you're dealing with an agent, you're dealing with someone who's kind of financially established, and, they're part of a team or a league that, is already, a multi-billion-dollar business model. And that, that these young athletes in these schools, are, it's important to make sure that you understand the broader context of how you're actually contracting and engaging with them. And, Michelle, you brought up a good point that, that we mentioned in our chats that I'm super passionate about, but it really is around athlete education and empowerment, and that there's certain brands that, have a really, powerful role to play, in my opinion, particularly in financial services and maybe fintech, where, they can really help, have a more, build a more long-term relationship and help prepare these athletes for the future, as it pertains to long-term success. I was listening to a podcast, and it was crazy. I heard this. I think it was a retired NFL player, and they were interviewing him and asking him about NIL, and the kind of hosts were kind of saying, oh, are you bummed out that you missed out on these deals back when you were in school? And, man, you could have had so much more money and blah, blah, blah. And, his response was pretty shocking. He actually said that, I'm actually glad that I didn't have that as a young 20-something-year-old kid, or, even late teen, because I probably would have gone broke at that point, which is just astonishing. But there's a truth to it, because again, yes, they're young athletes, but they're young people, and at a pivotal point in their development stage of growth. And that, looking upon it further, there's a high, bankruptcy and financial instability rate as it relates to athletes that have gone pro and in their first couple of years or after retirement. I think it was like 78% of NFL players and 60% of NBA players after 2 years of retirement have financial instability, and that's just wild. That's just absolutely crazy. And having the opportunity to have brand dollars at a young age potentially could be a part of helping this, but it actually could exacerbate this issue as well, if not, if there isn't the kind of proper education around contracts and financial responsibility and investing and all those sorts of things. So, long story short, I think brands, particularly in that space, have the opportunity to play an important role there.
And that's what I hope to see, because it's so much about the education. It's not just executing these deals and, going through compliance and tracking. That's why the systems that Influencer has done, where, it's an automatic turnkey sort of tracking for taxes as well as compliance with your university, but also creating a sustainable business that stands the test of time. All these young athletes are going to be turning into like small business owners. So making sure they have the education and resources and teams to, be able to really, take this into their futures. That's what I hope to see, that longevity, not it just being a quick hit, but it's been providing great opportunity for people to have their families see them for the first time, play and do things like that. A lot of the HBCU schools have been doing tremendous job as well, and I hope that the athletes get what they need as they not just the 4 years, but I we're talking about the 4 years, but you guys talked a little bit about the impact on the Olympics and what that could look like. So I'd love you to sort of touch on, that entire element of it, because that was interesting when we did our touch base about sort of the funnel into the Olympics and how this could have an impact on that.
Yeah, no, I think, what's super interesting, and we'll talk about the Olympics, but, when we think about sort of the athlete going from, college to pro, I think you're almost having a very different type of athlete and mindset, right? Because, if you look at the pro game now, there's some really great sort of this hybrid mentality from an athlete perspective. Like you have Draymond and Steph, and like you have Durant, who, to keep the main thing, great on the court, but they're invested in, sort of, like music tech, all this other stuff, where it's like super interesting where they're maximizing their playing days, right? Versus waiting till, their playing careers finish to sort of start this other kind of like career outside of sports. And I think what NIL is going to do with some of these athletes going into that is like they're going to get reps early on, right? Like in college, where they have to like deal with, working through a brand partnership, Rob mentioned contracts, all this stuff, right? And now they're coming into the pro game and almost in a way, like more shovel ready to essentially maximize that playing career that they have, right? And not have to sort of wait till, maybe the end of the career to start or after it's done. And so it's this idea of like, I think, and I hope is like democratizing the opportunities to more athletes to engage in this, ability to sort of impact outside of what's on the court. And, and starting that process, with sort of the NIL activity that ultimately trains them to once they turn pro.
Yeah, Emeka, that's an amazing point. And, I had never thought about Olympic athletes as it relates to this issue. And you could just see the potential. I was watching a great documentary on HBO. I think it was The Weight of Gold. And it was talking about kind of when COVID had happened, it exacerbated some of these mental health issues and just some of these just fundamental challenges that these athletes face. And a lot of it, which was shocking because a lot of it I wasn't actually even that aware of, that so much of the training, so much of the expenditures, it's all personal. It's all something that they have to personally fund and support. And a lot of them are they're performing at the highest level in the entire world, and they're trying to live paycheck to paycheck, trying to maximize and cut whatever costs they possibly can just to even be able to sustain their training. So to be able to provide stability and kind of level that the playing field, and as you said, give them the reps that they need, like it's mind blowing of how much that can change, because that seems like such a big systemic issue that just it needs disruption, and this definitely feels like the right kind of disruption to solve it.
And it's right around the corner. It will be in LA in 28. So
yeah, there you go.
It's an exciting time for sports. I'm an East Coaster, but in LA right now, it's a very exciting time for sports out
here. You're at the heart of it all, Michelle.
I'd love to ask you guys, I mean, to stay on top of all this news and to advise your clients the right way. A lot of people, you know, I mean, I'm tracking it every day on my alerts, and it's like a full-time job with like 20 articles a day, just reading and staying on top of it all between the law journals, the news. So like how are you best, you know, staying on top of it? I mean, obviously you guys are in the business, but like for someone who might be less familiar, or, you know, clients who are outside of the sports realm, like what would you advise your specific clients and others who might not be as, you know, in the trenches to, like, you know, trusted sources to look at other than ESPN?
So like I'm always a firm believer of, you know, anything that is new and it's changing so fast, like probably the most important thing to have is perspective, right? So a lot of what I focus on is sort of the number of different types of perspectives and sources that I'm, you know, sort of having a conversation or absorbing NIL information. So that could come from, you know, talking to an athlete, could come from talking to someone from the school, could come from talking to someone at the brand level, right? Like the key here is it's developing at such a rate that it's really important to have the right array of perspectives, so you're capturing the full development and you don't have any blind spots. And so that's the thing I would sort of, you know, tell folks is like, make sure when you're reading something, when you're talking to someone, like you're actually like really focus on the perspective it's coming from, because we'll give you the full picture versus, you know, maybe reading the same article or reading sort of the, like going to the same sort of sources. So that's the one sort of thing I would just sort of say to everyone.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. And, you know, it's hard to speak specifically because I think each brand kind of has interest or has, you know, is curious about name and likeness for their own specific kind of objectives and, you know, what it really entails for them. But, you know, it honestly is just looking at, you know, how this can help, you know, do the things for their brand that, you know, and connect with the people that they're really looking to achieve. You know, a lot of it can be difficult for some of these brands that are used to just larger sports sponsorship commitments, and some of them they're called commitments. You know, they actually you know, are committed and signed to these long-term deals. So it can be a little hard to kind of make that fundamental pivot into something that is a little bit untested. It feels a little bit more maybe smaller, feels a little bit more like it's more niche. But I think what they have to realize is that, you know, brands, you know, again, like being the early adopters is a really special opportunity. And, you know, the brands that are early adopters and do and, you know, and kind of jump onto things from the onset, I definitely think are rewarded for it. And that there's a lot of ways that, you know, these athletes, you know, can really build their profiles and really can be successful. That doesn't depend on brands. There's so many things that they can do as, you know, a content creator, using social media, elevating, you know, their own profile, their own personality, and even using, you know, new technology and new platforms. You know, I saw that, you know, that there's a whole bunch of athletes creating NFTs on Legacy League. You know, that is something that obviously did not exist, you know, maybe I was gonna say 10 years ago, but it didn't exist maybe a year ago. I'm not entirely sure about that trajectory, but you know, there's so many other ways that athletes are, you know, building a business, building a brand, building success and building their own profile. And that, you know, brands that, you know, kind of can help them do that from the early onset will be rewarded for sure.
So what would you guys like to see sort of in the magic crystal ball of this all changing, let alone 1 month, 6 months, a year from now? You know, what do you hope to see, or what do you hope to sort of manifest and execute and put out in this world with your creative leadership roles in this space?
Like, I think, you know, one of the things I would love to see is if NIL can continue on its positive benefit trajectory, right? Like we talked about inclusion, right? We talked about bringing, I think opportunities to whether it's HBCUs or like elevating female sports and the female college athlete. Like I think if it can do that, right, then I think overall it would have been really good for college sports. But there's still a lot to be written, in how sort of NIL plays out, and, with certainly some, pros aspect to it and potentially some downside aspect to it. So that's my hope, because if we can ultimately make the college game better for everyone through this, I think that's a win for sports. And I also think that's a win for our athletes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I understand why, the college, the NCAA and a lot of these institutions are definitely concerned. Obviously, financially, it's very kind of threatening to the current model, but I do understand kind of the broader concerns around, preserving and advancing sport and competitive fairness and all those sorts of things. And I actually think that it should be, a good thing, and it actually should progress sport and democratize sports and level the playing field a little bit in a way that, hasn't provided those opportunities in the past to, marginalize sports, marginalize athletes, marginalize communities, and looking at, how we can actually push that forward. And I think, an example of this that we've seen in culture that's similar is kind of is Overtime Elite, the high school sports league that, was really created kind of in conjunction with some of these issues, and these these young athletes that weren't getting the proper funding, training, education that they needed. And it's actually created a product that has been shown to be very engaging and something that people wanted and are looking for. So I think this can be a ripple effect to really disrupt the sport for better. It could even like we said, and maybe even create a new model in these traditional sports.
Well, I know with just the two of you and your minds together, you will be writing the history and the playbook for NIL moving forward. So it's such an honor to moderate you guys and to be part of this discussion, and hope we can really, create impact here for, the long haul.
I think you will be, revolutionizing NIL, Michelle, with your,
if you just want the timeline and the 50-page thesis.
Please send me the 50-pager.
Yeah.
Looking forward
I got out of law
that.
school a little early today. My professor knows I'm here with you, gents. So after this, I'm driving to class. So.
Awesome session, guys. Thank you so much. I love that closing point. I think it's just been so unfair watching the schools and the head coaches making millions of dollars salaries, and these athletes, one play away from, permanent injury or ruining their career or, affecting their future life. So I think this is a long time coming, and I'm really excited to see where it continues to go. We're going to be doing these probably every 6 months or so. NIL, as you guys know, we formed our own influential NIL division. It's a core tenet of what we're doing. We see the importance of it, and we thank thought leaders like you guys for all joining us, and hope that you guys can join us again in the future.